C'est à vous à décider, moi je sais
The exhibition's title or subtitle is an exhibition that thinks about edification. And I think this is important in the sense that I'm presenting it as a proposal about thinking about a very complex term to describe edification. First, it's the idea of spiritual, moral, intellectual improvement by ways of the instruments of society, like education and information. When I talk about edification, it's a very practical term in terms of its implementation in societies, but it's also a historical term that has a long tradition, starting with religions, and still today, of course, in religion it's very present, but it seems to have disappeared or semi-invisible in contemporary theory, partially because of the illusion that representative democracies or contemporary societies, democratic societies, don't edify. Edification is seen as something that is against, the idea of a liberal democracy. But of course, it's very embedded, not just in the present moment, but it's embedded in. I call it something very archaic. It's something that it's very difficult to touch on because it's instantly part of every person living today. It's part of what I'm saying now. So it's a very complicated terminology. One reason I think is, on a theoretical level, is that in contemporary theory, we have basically two poles. I think this is a result of how the structure of information is based on the economy, or how the economy runs the structure of information. And this, I think, in a sense, has developed these two poles in contemporary theory. And when I mean contemporary, I mean like theory that's happening really now. It was, I think, different in the up until the 80s. But when we talk now, I think basically we have theorists and thinkers who structure their ideas towards the notion that ideology is the main cause of our kind of I don't want to say suffering in the world, but the main cause of our problems and miseries and our way of thinking and our way of acting. It doesn't have to be so dramatic. And on the other pole, I think there are people who structure their ideas around that culture is the most important notion that develops and affects our way of life. Of course, there are other thinkers that try and move away from these polarities, ideology and culture, and we find this in the attempt of, let's say, the more recent philosophical movements like object-oriented philosophy or the what is being called speculative realism. I think that for me, trying to find something that is embedded in politics and is embedded in an understanding of human relations, but that tries to move away from the two polarities of ideology and culture is important. And I think this is why I'm interested in the term edification as one of the ways of doing this. In a sense, I think edification is much deeper than the idea of ideology. In ideology, you can always, in a sense, use it as a coat hanger, and at the same time remain, in a sense, outside of it, or partially outside of it. But I think with edification, with something so embedded and so archaic and so composite, I think it's much more difficult, and it really has a lot to do with existential ideas I've kind of formulated over the years. The work behind this, I think, is very indicative of this, my understanding of what this could be. In this work by Louis Camnitzer, he finds an archive online of death row prisoners in the state of Texas, and he takes samples of this archive and threads them together into one whole sentence. These are the last words spoken by death row prisoners in reality. So these are, we know that these are original certified statements. And he threads them into a beautiful 6-page text, and these are the 6 pages in the space here, almost continuously without paragraphing. What we get to see, or what we get to kind of penetrate, I think, is the idea that actually, all these death row prisoners basically say the same thing. They all have certain ways of reacting to these last moments before they're led to their final moment of life. And this is a cliche. I think this is a very, for me, this is a cliche, but it's a cliche that reveals a cliche. And I think this is important. That to be faced with the fact that sometimes cliches are no more than what they seem to be, I think is important, because in art and within political theory and very much within philosophy, we are always defying the cliche. We're always trying to, go against the tide, go against the expectations, go against the limitedness of life. The limitedness of perhaps our minds. I don't know the proper way to structure the statement, but I think in this work, in a sense, there's an acceptance of this cliche, and there's actually a double cliche in this work. The second cliche is that besides the fact that they're all saying basically the same thing, or their emotions are basically centered around the same way of expressing themselves in these final moments, let's say the stylistic qualities and the flavor of the words they say take up their different cultures. So you can distinctly tell in the text when a death row inmate is of an African American origin, of a Hispanic origin, if he or she is a Muslim, the different qualities of cultures are there, and in a sense that's also a cliche. The cliche that what makes us different is basically our cultural heritage, and I think to have both these cliches in one work is very strong, because I think in a sense it confronts you. It confronts you with the question: so what if this is basically the grit of it, or the reality of it? So in that sense, this work interests me in that it's very confrontational with these cliches that are very much in the embedded in this idea of edification. Had these people developed their personalities and their selves within the context of a different world system throughout history, the result might have been very different if the world system was a world system where the idea of culture and ideology were not the dominant poles. I think they probably would have said very different things. So I think the fact that they utter these utterances in the way that exactly the same way we expect them to has a lot to do with the idea of edification. I think in other works there's a different in the exhibition. There's a different take on edification. For example, the kind of curatorial intervention where I worked with Kadist to make 3 replicas of works by Martin Kippenberger from a period where Kippenberger was making these sculptures that I think indicated his interest in spatial interventions that look like furniture. But not to just make them, but actually to use them within the exhibition, I think was the intention. And we have a good example where the work by Jesse Ash is actually supported by a Kippenberger table. I think the Kippenberger table and the Jesse Ash piece, I think they make for me it's quite a subtle relationship. The heaviness of the projector itself as a object and a machine producing the image of Jesse Ash's work, which again has a little bit to do with the idea of within the context of this exhibition, has a little bit to do with the idea of the cliche in a sense, because it's really kind of referencing this whole tradition of understanding the hermetic artist, the hermetic artist who is constantly dedicating his or her life to the some kind of unknown to most people, unknown beauty in real objects. Such an artist would be Giorgio Morandi, who's I think the reference point for this work. But of course Jesse imposes a code that is about contemporary politics on the work, and I think he does it in a very interesting way. But I think these 2 poles here, where we have the very delicate organization and reorganization of fragile objects continuously in the motion picture, and they're carried by this table that can barely carry itself in a sense. It's very flimsy. It doesn't look as if it's an object that can actually carry a weighty projector, but somehow it manages to work. The starting point for actually having these works in the exhibition came by through coming across this incident that happened last year, where a cleaning lady in a museum in Düsseldorf damaged a piece by Kippenberger, which was called "When It Starts Dripping from the Ceiling." Thus the exhibition title, which is "When It Stops Dripping from the Ceiling." She actually removed a kind of faux puddle, a puddle that Kippenberger made on part of the installation, where he painted it to look like a real puddle. And through the cleaning, she removed this puddle. And what I think it for me, it kind of indicates having these sculptures in the space here and in this exhibition. I think it subtly indicates class distinctions of. There's a tradition. There's a tradition, particularly in the States in the 80s and 90s. There were a lot of artists referencing the, let's say, the workers in a museum, those who don't come from an intellectual background or a background of art or art history and so on. The guards, the cleaners, and so on, and particularly the artists of African American origin. There was a really very interesting line of work where they often worked with these people and or referenced them in their museum pieces or museum installations. But I wanted to do this on a much subtler level, I think, and on a level that doesn't actually bring in people, but in a sense just references, that makes that reference to the work itself, to the possibility of the work actually losing its meaning but gaining another meaning. And I think we're allowed to do that. And I think that only makes the work stronger, contrary to popular belief. I think it's a way of actually, I wouldn't say paying tribute, but I think adding a different dimension than the artist intended is something that's a very valid approach to think of when constructing an exhibition. And so Kippenberger's work in this exhibition is not really Kippenberger's work, but it's Kippenberger's work. So I think it gives a dimension that is important for the idea, I think, of when can we understand, when is that moment when for example, a young artist or an art student just studying in an academy begins to be enlightened by the fact that this table is actually art. When does that moment happen? And who is allowed to have that moment within the construct of society? So it's, I think, in a sense, depriving the audience from having that moment, or playing with the idea of deprivation and allowing, or the allowance of that moment is what this work is trying to do, or these three works are trying to do in the space. And in a sense, there's an echo of that in the work of Iman Issa, who has made this beautiful piece, I think deceptively simple. The work is called Laboring, and she references on the wall we see a little plaque where I don't know if she describes or she actually takes a description of a drawing made in the 60s in the, let's say, kind of socialist period in Egypt. There was a trend, of artists trying to, let's say, embody some of the values of this certain political moment. And in this work, Iman describes a particular drawing where there are laborers. It's called Laboring, and there are laborers, there are farmers, they're working together to produce something or to plant something. And the idea is about productivity and making, as most socialist oriented practices of this period were around the world. In her work, next to this plaque, there's a very, I I don't know how to describe it. You know, I don't want to use the word minimal, but for lack of better wording at the moment, I think it's minimal in the sense that it's about the essence of something. The sculpture itself, I think, captures the essence of that other work from the 60s. But it captures it also, I think it's linked to the Kippenberger in the sense of the conceptual side of the Kippenberger installation, in the sense that it's also about deprivation. It deprives it from its ideology. It deprives it from the whole edification that comes from the ideological process. You know, the laborers with the strong muscles and like the tools and all that kind of stuff that we that can't carry ideas anymore, that can't carry a true edification anymore, I think. What the work does is that it captures the essence of something while also depriving it of something else, depriving it of its ideology, depriving it of its historical moment. It becomes a timeless, universal object that works through the mechanism of deprivation. And I think that's a very interesting and beautiful thought.